Hi, I'm Professor Tim Hamilton, Professor of Economics, and we're going to talk about stagflation because stagflation is coming up in the news nowadays. Stagflation is actually two words that were sort of thrown together back in 1965. I think it was Ian MacLeod, a British politician. In the UK, they had a stagnant economy with a lot of unemployment, but they also had inflation. So we had stagnant economy plus inflation, thus the phrase stagflation. Now, stagflation is a very unusual phenomenon, extremely unusual. Very, very rarely do we ever see this happen. We in the United States saw it happen in the 70s, and that was because of a supply shock. So whenever we have stagflation, we're going to have a supply shock. And what I mean by a supply shock, and I'll go into that a little more here in a few minutes, is when something affects suppliers across the entire United States. Some common denominator raises their costs, raises their prices, and thus they pass it along to the end consumer. Thus the prices get pushed up. But at the same time, they start lowering the level of employment. They lay workers off because they're seeing their prices go up. They need to have a profit margin. So the labor is the grease in the machinery. So they start laying workers off. So unemployment starts to rise. So you have people out of work. So we have people out of work. And high prices. And I'm going to tell you why this is so unusual, why it's a very odd phenomenon, and why you have a supply shock. Because we have our business cycle. And in our business cycle, as we've learned in our macroeconomics class, we have peak times where we have inflation, and this is when the economy is humming along, as ours here has been. This video is being shot in April 2025. And when everybody is working, some people are working overtime, some people are working a second job, people have extra incomes. What do they do with that extra moolah? They spend it. So more and more spending bids prices up, and that's why we have inflation in the upper end of the business cycle. The other part of the business cycle is when we are in the trough, and this is when we have unemployment. Unemployment occurs when businesses lay people off. They can't spend incomes they haven't earned, so they're spending less and less, so we see consumption drop. When businesses are seeing their inventories pile up, they decide to lay even more workers off, and that's how we head down further and further in the business cycle towards unemployment. If we get 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP, that's what we end up calling a recession. So because of the business cycle, you either have unemployment or inflation. You either have many people out of work, although you do get low prices as a result. And why do you get low prices when we're at the bottom end of the business cycle? Because if people aren't out there spending a lot of stuff, the demand for things drops. And when the demand for things drops, those prices go down. So the one saving grace when you're in the low end of the business cycle with people out of work is you do get low prices. On the other hand, when we have inflation, we have high prices, but at least everyone is out there working. So if this is true, you either get this or you get that. How can you get both at the same time? If you look at the economy as an organism, think of ourselves as human beings. We breathe in, we breathe out. We inhale, we exhale. You can't inhale and exhale both at the same time, right? You can if you've been in a car wreck. Now, back to our word stagflation. I have to give credit to my friend Paul, who has said that stagflation is actually taking inflation to the prom. by yourself. That's stagflation. Let's look at it on a graph over here. We've got aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So in our macro class, we've drawn this several times. I haven't distinguished whether this is long run or short run aggregate supply. Just bear with me. This is aggregate supply. This is where our economy is right now in April of 2025. We got 2.4% inflation rate. So I've got on the price level axis here, I'm actually writing the inflation rate. And then we have a level of real GDP, $23.5 trillion, which coincides with 4.2% unemployment. Now, both my 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock macroeconomics classes analyzed the effect of a current supply shock, because right now our current supply shock is we're having high tariffs and higher labor prices. The tariffs have been put out on all countries. The biggest trading partners with the United States, China, Mexico, and Canada all have higher tariffs. So how do higher tariffs result in stagflation? Well, something that is a supply shock that causes costs for businesses all over the country to go up is going to cause our aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. So I'm going to call this AS1, and this is going to be aggregate supply curve 2. So we have a new equilibrium point here. We started at this equilibrium point, and now we're at this equilibrium point, which results in more inflation. So this rise here is what we call inflation. And this gap here, you can see we are now at a lower level of real GDP. And let's see, I'll call this one, just for the sake of a number, 22 trillion. And it's going to coincide with 6% unemployment. So we see we have more unemployment here. Along with more inflation. So yes, the 11 o'clock and the 2 o'clock classes both analyze this the same way. Pat yourselves on the back for correctly analyzing that. And this is what we end up getting, because the tariffs are raising the prices on components all throughout the businesses in the United States. Take an F-150 pickup truck. It has electronic ignition. That electronic ignition module comes from China. You can't go out into the forest and cut off a branch of an electronic ignition component. That has to be manufactured somewhere and brought in. Your big flat screen TV, the components of a flat screen TV, you can't dig it out of the ground and grab it. It has to be imported from somewhere. And all sorts of other things, even services. For example, you go to the doctor and have an MRI done. Well, that MRI machine comes from Germany. So when tariffs roll across businesses all across the United States, that causes their costs to go up. When their costs go up, that's our supply shock. Where are the higher labor prices coming from? Well, that has to do with immigration. A lot of the low-wage immigrants that work in the United States come from Mexico. When we see a lot of immigration come to a halt, well, that means the building trades particularly, also in agriculture, those workers have to be replaced. So those low-wage workers have to be replaced with higher-wage workers. So again, the costs that businesses are paying are going up. So we have sort of two things that are pushing our aggregate supply to the left. So as a result of that, we end up with the highly unusual situation of inflation trying to color coordinate these for you, and unemployment. Now, the tough part once you get into stagflation is how do you get out of it? Because we've got inflation, but we also have more unemployment. So the problem once you get into stagflation is how to get out of it. If you spend more money, if the government decides to spend more money to try to get aggregate demand to shift this away, well, then you have even more inflation. So at least the remedy that was done in the 70s was for the Federal Reserve to take inflation by the horns and reduce it by raising interest rates. And that is why we've seen some friction between the Federal Reserve and the White House right now, because the Federal Reserve is looking at this and saying, okay, well, it's probably going to be up to us to fix this. And to fix this, we're going to have to raise interest rates as we did in the 70s. And unfortunately, the bad news is it takes a long time to get out of it. But there you go. That is what stagflation is. And I'll see you in the next video.